The light bulb went off. I'm talking glowing, shining bright. You know, when the light bulb goes off for you, like when you've been striving towards something and you realize there's a better and an easier way to do the thing. It's when the figurative walls of Jericho come tumbling down on top of the assumptions you had. And it's so freeing. Let me tell you the story. I cautioned someone in my flight podcast group program about a trap that I see a lot of business owners and new podcasters making. The trap that I fear too many people fall into is that they only have one type of format for their podcast. The trap can look really appealing, but it will hurt you in the end. And although I feel that having only one type of format for your podcast is detrimental for your podcast, for your business growth, the trap many podcasters flock to is solely doing one type of format, and that is doing interview format alone. So this is how it happens. They've seen popular influencers interview big name guests and they think they can do the same thing. They think that they can become just like that big influencer or have a large podcast or a large social media following because they have really big names on their podcast. But the truth is, the best way to grow your business with a podcast is not from doing interviews. I know, right? Is the light bulb going out off for you too? Maybe not, but hear me out, okay? Business owners make this mistake all the time, and it irritates me, but most of all, it breaks my heart. All this work, all this time that you put into your podcast to highlight someone else's business, because you probably have heard me say that interviewing other people for your podcast takes a lot of time, way more time than if you did a solo episode. So, it's the reach out, it's the first engage with them in social media so that they don't think you're rando. And then you start engaging with them. And then you reach out and say, can I send you an email? And then you send an email and then you form the questions and then you schedule it. And then they come on your show and then the editing. And then you re-email them and say, here's your links and here's where to listen. Here's the graphics. So I just want you to know it takes a lot more time than a solo episode. So when I see business owners make this mistake, um, that they're putting all this work into the interview and then they're highlighting someone else's business. They're pretty much saying, hey, I'm going to give you my listeners' attention. Here's the microphone. And they may have good downloads from that, the podcaster, but they're not making any money for their business. And so let me tell you, let's just clear it up. Let me tell you what interviews do for your podcast. Okay. Because I don't want you to think interviews are bad and never do them. Not at all. But let me tell you what they do for your podcast. Okay. So if you have somebody coming on your show and maybe they're a bigger name or a medium sized name that you're like, oh, people would know who this is, and it's in my niche. That episode of your podcast will grow, like those downloads will show that is a big name guest. Okay. So it will grow your download numbers for that specific interview episode from that big name. Okay. So it will grow your downloads for that episode. Okay. And then that's number one. Number two is that it is building that authority, and I call it legitness. So people take you more seriously or think that you're more legit when you have a big name or medium name and you can hold your own with them. Like you can interview them and it can go really well and smoothly. Okay, so that's the number two thing, is that it builds you that credibility, that authority. Okay, when you have a big name on on your podcast, or even just a no name, an interview, it shows that you are building that authority and that trust. And when I say, you can hold your own with them. So it does do that. And then number 3 that an interview can do for your podcast is that it can make you feel like a big deal. And I'm kind of cringing at that because I've been there, y'all. I've totally been there. And when you get a big name on your podcast and you're like, oh my goodness, this is such a big deal. Like, but it's really more of like, you feel like you're a big deal. I'm just being gut level honest. And so, have y'all ever? I grew up watching I Love Lucy. Okay. I couldn't watch the Smurfs. Smurfs were not. We couldn't watch that. Okay. Conservative 1980s, 90s, no Smurfs. But I Love Lucy and Andy Griffith. And listen, I'm not complaining. Okay. That I'm not complaining about my sheltered background at all. Okay. That was the umbrella of protection, and I'm fine. I'm good with that. It's fine. But I do remember that episode. Remember the episode where Lucy, she says, she's talking to Ricky and she goes, it's your neurotic need to be in the spotlight. And he goes, mine, he has accent, Cuban accent. My neurotic need to be in the spotlight. And he leaves his mouth open. She goes, how do you like them apples? And she goes, and close your mouth. He goes, what apples? It's funny. I'll have to find that episode and put it in the show notes. I don't even know how to do that. I mean, like it's on Netflix anymore. We had them all on VHS tape. Shout out to all the gals or guys in the 1990s with the shout out for that in the 90s with our VHS tapes. Okay. So that's the third reason is that what interviews can do. I mean, it could make you feel like a big deal. I'm not saying these are great things. I'm just saying it is what it is. Okay. So number 1, they grow your downloads for that specific episode. You can have that building that authority or really credibility when you can hold your own with that person in an interview. And then number 3 is that it makes you feel like more of a big deal. Okay. So, and I want to clarify this. Interviews are great. Like they are great to grow your podcast in the number of downloads because hopefully they are sharing about your episode and you're sharing, and that's the cross promotion. Okay. So that is it. They're great to grow your podcast downloads, but unless you have a strategic plan in that interview, it will not grow your business. It will not. I'm going to say that as clear as I can. Unless you have a strategic plan with that guest on your podcast, it will not grow your business. I'm putting my finger down right on my flat hand, and I'm getting my teacher hat on and my firm voice because it will not. Okay. And I want you to really reframe it as thinking of needle moving activities. Okay. If you have a podcast and you're like, you know what, this is passion project, I don't have a business, go for it. Spend the extra time, invest in that guest interview. Awesome. But I am specifically talking to business owners who want to grow their business. So think needle moving activities. How can this interview be a needle moving activity? Okay. I'm going to get to that in a minute. I'm going to tell you how you can make that interview work for you. Okay. And make it into a needle moving activity. Okay. But before that, I want to tell you 3 reasons. I think 3 is the magic number. These are 3 reasons why we feel like we have to do interviews only. Okay. This is where I'm kind of pulling myself back to 7 years ago. And I'm thinking, okay, Ren, why did you do interviews only? Okay. At the first part. Second part, I started doing monologue solo episodes of what God was showing me. It was awesome. And people loved them. And then I stopped doing them again. I don't know why. I went back to interviews and it was fine. But this is why we feel like we have to do interviews only. Okay. So number 1, everybody else does it. Like when you hear a podcast, you're like, oh yeah, that interview. Yeah, that guest. That's what everybody thinks a podcast is about. And it can be, but that's not the only thing else. And so we think of everybody else is doing it. So yeah, okay, having an interview only. Yeah, every week, everybody else does it. Okay. So that's number 1. Number 2 is we want that validation. We want that validation with those big name guests. Okay. I'm not saying this is right. I'm just saying we want the validation. Okay. With the big name guest. All right. Okay. And number 3, we're hiding behind the mic. We're featuring others. If we're featuring others, if we're like, hey, look, here's this interview. then we can't share or we won't share what God has shown us what to do. This was me. This was me. I was hiding behind the mic. God had given me a voice. God had given me a story, and I didn't share it because I was hiding behind my interviews. Okay. That's 3 reasons why people do only interviews. Okay. But also, I want to say, okay, I want to say, I'm going to get a little snarky up in here. Okay. Get my little fun voice on. Some people, and yeah, not all people are meant to interview at all. Okay. Not all people are meant to interview. When I hear some that are usually solo episode recorders, and then they start doing an episode with a guest, and I'm all for just making it varied and vary your podcast format. But some people are not meant to interview. And what I say that is if you do an interview and you interrupt the person all the time, or you don't spend time researching good questions and you just kind of do just like laissez-faire, just kind of just okay questions, maybe the questions that other people are asking. Um, or you just do it because the guest has a book coming out. you know, that's when you know, okay, I probably don't need to interview. If you interrupt a lot when you're interviewing, I mean, you can listen back. You can hear, I mean, you can hear that on other people's podcasts. Like you hear an interview, and if they interrupt that guest a lot, they don't need to be interviewing. They just don't. Like it's just that's all is to it. So if they interrupt, or if you interrupt, or if you don't want to ask questions or don't ask really good questions that no one else is asking, or if you're just doing it because somebody is a big name and they have a book coming out, um, you probably are not meant to interview, especially the first two. Like if you interrupt a lot and if you don't ask good questions, that's probably just your sign to be like, maybe I don't even need to interview at all. Um, and yes, the best way to get a big name on your podcast is when they have a book coming out. Okay, I'm going to do a big eye roll right here. Can you feel it? I have to have a sigh in there too. And if you do have someone on your podcast or they reached out to you or something, the publisher reached out to you and said, hey, can they come on your podcast because they have a book coming out? If you do, and it is something in your niche, please offer value as well. Please. Ask questions that get that author to offer value. Okay. Like ask them three practical tips that your book shares with us about, like please make sure that the value is there if they are talking about their book for sale. Like even if they don't offer value, I mean, hopefully they would, but you offer value. Okay. But what I want to share with you now is how you can have an interview on your podcast and do it that both highlights their business. Okay. That both highlights their business, offers value to your listeners. Remember, you are choosing it for your listeners, and that it helps your business. Okay. So I'm going to be interviewing a new Instagram friend of mine. You may have heard of her, Virginia Kerr, and you have seen and heard of her on Instagram and probably her podcast at This is Virginia Kerr. So she's going to be offering value to you, my listeners, about video strategy. But also, I am specifically asking her a question about how she hired her business coach from hearing the coach on the coach's podcast. And so as a podcast strategist, that is the ultimate proof that podcasting can grow your business. And she is proof of that. And so I also have an affiliate link for her video course. This is Video School because I am in it. I am in her program. So there are 3 benefits to having her coming on my show. That is when the interview is worth it. That is when the interview is gold. Okay. So the first reason is because I'm asking her about her experience of how she hired a business coach from hearing the coach on her coach's podcast. That's because I interacted with her on Clapper and I saw this comment she left on my clapper one of my clapper videos. And so that's the first thing, is that is huge for me as a strategist. That's proof. Proof is in the pudding. And then number two is I have an affiliate link for her program. So that's going to be a needle moving activity for my business. And then number three, I know she's going to release incredible value to my listeners. So it's like those three things. And yes, is she a big name? Absolutely. But that's just a bonus. That's just the cherry on top, because the other three things are important for my listeners and my business. Do you see how you can look at it differently and look at it through eyes that way, where you're like, oh, this is beneficial to my business? Because that's what we're doing a podcast, right? Yes, there's a lot of ways to, you are increasing that know, like, and trust factor, and the visibility, um, and the credibility and all the things, but it is ultimately to grow your business. Okay. So back to the story from the beginning. The group member whose light bulb came on for her podcast, I think she even felt relieved to not have to do an interview episode every single week. I could see the relief just wash over her. And then she realized that the way to grow her business through a podcast is not featuring someone else. There's space for that. But the most important thing that she needs to do is give value and to point her people back to her services more than she has guests on her podcast. Okay. So is this you? Was this helpful to you? Because I want to always bring value to you and helpfulness to you. But this was something that was just, back down the South, we call it, like, just got it by my crawl, like you just were like, oh, it irritates me, but it breaks my heart when business owners do this, or new podcasters. So make sure that you listen, and make sure that you do just have variety in the format of your podcast. Okay. So that's the main thing I wanted to share with you today. And so if you are that person that's like, yes, I love this, I am here for this, I love this value, take a screenshot, put it on Instagram, tag me, and say that you enjoyed this episode. And I can't wait to see you next week. We've got some really good things for you this summer coming up. Yes, the Virginia Kerr episode, and then an episode that will feature a friend of mine who has been in my flight group program. So I can't wait for you to hear that. So stick around, and I'll see you next time. Remember, I'm here to help you, because life is too short to just wing it. Bye, friend.